In the winter of 1847, a mining agent named Samuel O. Knapp was cutting through second-growth forest on a ridge above the Ontonagon River, 12 miles upstream from where it empties into Lake Superior, when the ground gave him a reason to stop walking. The forest floor along that ridge was pocked with shallow depressions, dozens of them, arranged in a rough line that followed a vein of rock rather than any path a river or a glacier would carve. Knapp was not a geologist and had not been sent to find anything old. He worked for a company hunting native copper, the raw metal that turns up in this part of Michigan already pure, ready to be hammered into shape without ever touching a furnace. He opened one of the depressions anyway. What he found at the bottom, after digging through feet of packed clay and rotted leaf litter, was a mass of native copper 10 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, nearly 2 feet thick, hammered smooth on its upper face and raised off the floor of the pit on a cradle of oak logs. The wood had gone soft as wet peat, but the shape of the cribbing was intact. Growing directly above the packed-in pit was a hemlock that Knapp had to cut down to clear the site. He counted the rings, 395 of them. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Whoever had raised that 7.5-ton mass on a bed of oak, then abandoned it as too heavy to move, had done so before a tree with 4 centuries of growth in it had so much as taken root on the spot where they left it. Knapp reported the find to his employers, and within a year the company that formed around the claim, the Minnesota Mining Company, its name permanently misspelled by a clerical error at incorporation, began pulling commercial quantities of copper from ground that someone else had already worked by hand. Knapp's report is usually cited as the moment ancient mining in the Lake Superior Basin entered the written record. It was not, in fact, the first time Europeans had noticed it. Jesuit missionaries had mentioned native copper along the lake as early as 1636, and French traders had heard the same thing from Ojibwe guides for 2 centuries before that. But nobody with the authority to file a report had ever opened one of the pits and looked at what was underneath. Once Knapp did, everyone else started looking too, and what they found did not stay confined to one ridge above one river. By the 1860s, a surveyor and former army engineer named Charles Whittlesey had mapped thousands of these pits, scattered across the Keweenaw Peninsula and the smaller island of Isle Royale, 30 miles out into the lake itself. Whittlesey published his findings through the Smithsonian Institution in 1863, under the plain title Ancient Mining on the Shores of Lake Superior, and the map that accompanied it, showing the pits strung like beads along the mineral range of the Keweenaw, remains the best single record of how extensive the old workings were before 19th-century mining destroyed most of them chasing the same veins. Whittlesey wrote, with the caution of a man who knew he did not have the whole picture, that an ancient people had extracted copper from these deposits. He could not say who they were, he could not say when they had done it. He had the pits, the tools left inside them, and no framework built to hold the answer, because the answer, when it finally arrived, would not come from a survey crew at all. The pits themselves, once opened, told a consistent story wherever investigators looked. Excavators repeatedly found the same debris scattered around any large mass of copper, thin, irregular chips with concave and convex surfaces, the unmistakable residue of pounding a nugget flat by hand, alongside stone hammers battered and sometimes fractured at one end from the work of striking rock. Where the copper was still locked inside the rock rather than lying loose as float, the miners used fire setting, building a fire directly against the vein, letting the rock heat for hours, then dousing it with water carried up from the river. The sudden temperature change cracked the stone along its natural fractures without harming the malleable copper inside, and the charcoal left behind by those fires, scattered at the bottom of pit after pit, is one of the materials that later gave radiocarbon dating something to measure. A federal survey published in 1850, the report on the geology and topography of a portion of the Lake Superior Land District, prepared by geologists John Wells Foster and Josiah Whitney, recorded Knapp's find in its own official language, describing the mass as resting on billets of oak supported by sleepers of the same material, and noting that the ancient miners had evidently raised it several feet before abandoning the effort as too laborious to continue. Decades after that, the Smithsonian's William Henry Holmes carried out his own excavation at the pits, documenting hammerstones layer by layer rather than relying on second-hand accounts passed along by mining companies. 3 separate institutions, spaced across roughly half a century, each investigated the same district, and none of their findings were ever assembled into a single coordinated study. What Knapp and Whittlesey had stumbled into was the tail end of a mining tradition that current archaeology now places among the oldest metalworking traditions anywhere on Earth. The people who worked this copper were not smelting it. Lake Superior float copper occurs in a state pure enough to be cold hammered directly into knives, spear points, awls, and fish hooks, heated periodically to keep the metal from cracking as it was worked but never melted, and poured the way bronze or iron would later be. For decades, the age of this activity was guessed at from tree rings and depth of burial, the same rough method Knapp had used without knowing it. Radiocarbon dating, once it became available in the 1950s, pushed the estimate back to roughly 3,800 years before the present. Then, in 2021, a team led by geologist David Pompiani combined radiocarbon dates from organic material still embedded in copper artifacts with lead pollution records preserved in lake sediment cores, a method that tracks the smoke and dust thrown off by fire setting, the technique of heating rock and dousing it with water to crack it open. Their results extended the record of old copper complex activity back as far as 8,500 years before the present, with some evidence for copper use in the region stretching past 9,500 years. Separate sediment work at Macargo Cove on Isle Royale dated mining there to between 6,500 and 5,400 years ago. Bronze Age metalworking in the Near East, the tradition most textbooks still credit as the world's earliest, begins several thousand years later than that. The finished objects that came out of this tradition ranged well beyond utilitarian blades. Caches recovered across Wisconsin and Michigan include spuds, gouges, and crescent-shaped ornaments worked entirely by cold hammering, and by the time Lake Superior copper was reaching Hopewell burial sites in Ohio, centuries later, it was being fashioned into breastplates, ear spools, and panpipes buried with the dead as markers of status, rather than used as tools at all. The scale of what this activity produced is difficult to reconcile with the size of the societies believed to have produced it. Estimates of the total volume of copper removed from the Lake Superior district across the span of ancient mining run into the hundreds of millions of pounds, extracted by hunter-gatherer and fisher communities using stone hammers, fire, and patience, with no draft animals, no wheeled transport, and no metal tools of their own to dig with beyond the copper itself. And the copper did not stay near the lake. Laser ablation analysis of artifacts recovered from Hopewell burial mounds in Ohio's Scioto Valley, roughly 750 miles from the source, has traced a majority of the copper back to Isle Royale and the Keweenaw. Further south, at the Poverty Point site in Louisiana, one of the largest earthwork complexes in North America and roughly 3,500 years old, copper artifacts have likewise been sourced to Great Lakes deposits. A network moving raw copper from an island in the middle of Lake Superior to the floor of the Mississippi Valley had to exist to explain that distribution, and it had to exist for a very long time, because the artifacts span more than 1,000 years of use. The scale of the raw resource itself helps explain why this stretch of shoreline drew both ancient miners and, much later, an industrial rush of its own. When 19th-century companies began sinking real shafts instead of following surface pits, they occasionally struck masses of copper the ancient miners had never reached. In 1856, workers at the Minnesota mine, built on Knapp's original claim, tunneled into a single mass weighing an estimated 527 tons, among the largest ever recorded in the district. Deposits of that size explain both why a hunter-gatherer society organized itself around this resource for thousands of years, and why the veins those miners left untouched were still rich enough, a century later, to fund a modern industrial boom on ground they had only begun to work. Then, sometime around 3,000 years ago, the intensive extraction stopped. Archaeologists have found little evidence of new pits being opened on anything like the earlier scale after this point, even though the veins were nowhere near exhausted. Whole seams of accessible copper were left in the ground. Why the tradition wound down when it did remains an open question in the archaeological literature, with theories ranging from a shift in social value away from raw copper toward finished trade goods, to changes in regional population and settlement that redirected labor elsewhere. No single explanation has been confirmed. Some researchers point to a broader reorientation of archaic period exchange networks around this time, as finished goods and exotic materials from farther afield began to compete with raw copper for social and ceremonial importance. Others note that the sediment record shows mining continuing at a reduced, more localized scale for centuries after the peak, rather than stopping abruptly, which would argue for a long decline rather than a single triggering event. Neither explanation has displaced the other, and the honest answer, for now, is that the record simply goes quiet. What is not in question is who was mining. The old copper complex sits within the same long, continuous archaeological sequence that leads, without a break anyone has been able to identify, into the woodland period cultures and eventually into the ancestral populations of the Anishinaabe, the confederation of peoples that includes the Ojibwe, whose descendants still live along the Lake Superior shoreline today. That continuity is now the scientific consensus. It was not always treated that way, and the gap between what the ground showed and what 19th-century Americans were willing to write down is its own piece of evidence. When Knapp's pit and Whittlesey's map entered public awareness in the 1850s and 60s, the United States was in the middle of a much larger argument about who had built the earthworks and mounds scattered across the eastern half of the continent, structures whose scale struck most white observers as implausible for the native peoples then living among them. Thomas Jefferson had reached the opposite conclusion decades earlier, after personally excavating a mound in Virginia and describing the work as consistent with Native American burial practice, but his was a minority position that later, more politically motivated writers largely ignored. The explanation that gained the widest currency was that a separate, vanished race, more advanced, sometimes explicitly imagined as fair-skinned, had built the mounds and worked the mines before being wiped out or driven off by the ancestors of the indigenous nations the United States government was actively removing from their land, at the same time the theory was being written. The idea served a purpose beyond curiosity. If Native Americans were not the descendants of the people who accomplished this work, then dispossessing them of the land could be framed as a lesser act than displacing a nation's own forgotten ancestors would have been. Presidents cited it, including Andrew Jackson, who invoked the fate of a supposedly vanished mound-building race in a message to Congress defending Indian removal policy. Land companies benefited from it. The explorer and ethnologist John Wesley Powell would later dismiss the whole idea as a romantic fallacy, though not until decades after it had already done its political work. It was not a fringe position, it was closer to the default one, repeated in surveys, geological bulletins and popular magazines for the better part of a century, and it attached itself easily to the Lake Superior copper pits, since nobody writing those early reports had the tools to date them, and the Eastern Mound theory was already sitting there, ready to be borrowed. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The dismantling of that theory did not come quickly, and it did not come from the copper mines themselves. It came from Cyrus Thomas, an entomologist turned archaeologist working for the Bureau of Ethnology, the research arm the Smithsonian Institution had established in 1879 specifically to investigate Native American cultures. Congress funded Thomas for over a decade to survey mounds across the Mississippi and Ohio valleys and settle the question with evidence rather than assumption. His report, published in 1894, ran more than 700 pages and concluded, on the strength of 2 decades of excavation, that there was an unbroken line connecting the mound builders to the historical indigenous nations that later observers had refused to credit with the work. It is now regarded as a foundational document in the professionalization of American archaeology, precisely because it replaced a politically convenient myth with what the physical evidence had been saying the entire time. The copper mines of Lake Superior would take considerably longer to receive the same reckoning, largely because radiocarbon dating, the tool that could finally place them in an accurate chronology and tie them to a continuous cultural sequence, did not exist until well into the 20th century, and the lake sediment techniques that pushed that chronology back to 9,000 years did not arrive until the 21st. In the meantime, the mines themselves were being destroyed by the very industry that had rediscovered them. 19th-century prospectors used the ancient pits as a map, on the reasonable assumption that people working without machinery would only have dug where the copper was richest and closest to the surface. Companies drove their own shafts directly through the old workings, and in doing so cleared out stone hammers by the thousand, most of which were never catalogued, described only in passing in mining company reports before being discarded, sold as curiosities, or lost. The great copper mass Knapp found on its bed of oak was eventually cut apart and shipped out as raw ore. A separate mass found at the Minong mine on Isle Royale in June of 1874, weighing 5,720 pounds, fared slightly better in the short term, put on public display in a courthouse yard in Detroit, and then at the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, before it too was melted down and sold as commercial copper. There was no institution in the 19th century whose job it was to intervene, no framework under which an archaeological find on private mining land was treated as anything other than the property of the company that struck it. The record was not sealed away in an archive somewhere. It was extracted, smelted, and sold, piece by piece, by an industry with every financial incentive to keep moving. The Ontonagon boulder had already drawn one failed commercial venture a full century before Knapp ever reached the district. In 1771, the fur trader Alexander Henry, backed by British investors, brought a crew of miners to the riverbank near the boulder and attempted the first organized mining operation in what would become Michigan. His men tunneled into the bank without properly shoring the excavation, and the workings collapsed within the year, ending the venture before it produced any usable copper. The boulder itself stayed where it was for another 70 years, until the United States, having secured mineral rights across the region through the 1826 Treaty of Fond du Lac and the 1842 Treaty of La Pointe, opened the door to private extraction. A Detroit hardware merchant named Julius Eldred purchased the boulder directly from the Chippewa in 1841 for $150, then spent 2 more years and 2 failed expeditions dragging it toward the lake before finally succeeding in 1843. The treaties that made the purchase possible in the first place, negotiated between federal commissioners and Ojibwe leaders, are a matter of public record. What the boulder meant to the people who sold access to it survives mostly in the record that Schoolcraft and a handful of others thought to write down. What survives from the people who actually did the mining survives mostly in a different kind of record, one the mining companies had no reason to file and no authority to interpret. Henry Rowe Schoolcraft arrived at Sault Ste. Marie in 1822 as the United States Indian agent for the region, and he spent the following decades documenting Ojibwe language, oral tradition, and belief with a thoroughness that owed a great deal to his wife, Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, whose mother was Ojibwe and whose grandfather, Wabojig, had been a war chief. Jane taught Schoolcraft the language and gave him access to accounts he would never have reached alone. Among the traditions he recorded was the reverence attached to a specific mass of native copper on the Ontonagon River, a boulder weighing close to 2 tons, that had been known to Europeans since at least 1766, when the trader Alexander Henry saw it and later tried, unsuccessfully, to organize a mining company around it. The Ojibwe name recorded for the boulder was Misko Biawabik, and according to the tradition documented by Schoolcraft and later observers, it was understood as a gift from Gitche Manitou, the Great Spirit, and treated as sacred rather than as raw material to be extracted. That reverence was not confined to one boulder. The German travel writer and ethnographer Johann Georg Kohl, who spent time among Ojibwe communities on Lake Superior in the 1850s and published his account in 1859, described people carrying small pieces of copper wrapped carefully in their medicine bags, handed down across generations, credited with protective power. That description was not an isolated literary flourish. In October of 1863, miners clearing an old pit at the Hilton mine in the Ontonagon district, at a depth of about 9 feet, found a leather bag resting on a mass of copper the ancient miners had tried and failed to free from its vein. The bag was sewn shut, the hair still inside the hide, preserved by the same wet clay that had preserved the oak cribbing in Knapp's pit years earlier. Nobody recorded what, if anything, had been inside it. It was noted, briefly, in the mining literature of the period, and then the record moves on, the way it does in these reports, to depth measurements and ore percentages. The Ontonagon boulder itself produced the clearest documented encounter between institutional purpose and Ojibwe belief. When Michigan Territorial Governor Lewis Cass organized an expedition to reach the boulder in 1820, he needed a local guide who knew the route, and the Ojibwe he approached were reluctant, since the site was considered sacred ground. A guide known as White Pigeon eventually agreed to lead them. According to the account preserved from that expedition, the party lost the trail despite White Pigeon's familiarity with the country, and his own people took this as confirmation that the spiritual agencies protecting the boulder had closed the way against outsiders. The expedition reached the site only later, and what they found, once they arrived, showed generations of small-scale use rather than large-scale extraction, chisel marks and broken tools scattered nearby, evidence of pieces cut away and carried off over a long stretch of time rather than a single mining operation. Schoolcraft, present for a related survey, wrote plainly that the mass had likely been diminished over the years by this kind of piecemeal removal. A parallel record was being built from inside the Ojibwe community during these same decades. William Whipple Warren, born in 1825 to an Ojibwe mother, descended from a prominent Lake Superior family and a father of New England fur trading stock, worked as a translator, and later served in the Minnesota Territorial Legislature before dying of tuberculosis in 1853 at the age of 28. In his final years, he gathered the oral histories of Ojibwe elders into a manuscript recounting his mother's people's migrations, clan structures, and traditions, material he understood was at risk of disappearing as the older generation of fluent speakers passed away. His manuscript was not published until 1885, more than 3 decades after his death, under the title History of the Ojibwe People. Even Warren, writing from inside the culture he was documenting, was shaped by the intellectual currents of his own time, and his history entertained a connection between the Ojibwe and the lost tribes of Israel, an idea then circulating widely among native and non-native writers alike. What his work preserved regardless was a body of testimony no government survey had any mechanism for collecting, evidence of the same continuity that radiocarbon dating and lake sediment analysis would not confirm by independent scientific means for more than a century afterward. None of this made it into the mining company reports, the state geological surveys, or the early Smithsonian bulletins on ancient mining, which treated the pits purely as engineering curiosities and left the question of belief and meaning to a different and considerably less funded branch of inquiry. Ethnography and extraction proceeded on separate tracks through most of the 19th century, gathered by different institutions, published in different journals, and rarely cross-referenced. The Bureau of Ethnology that eventually funded Cyrus Thomas's Mound survey was only 5 years old when Thomas began his fieldwork, and its resources were nowhere near sufficient to also undertake a systematic study of the Lake Superior copper pits. Douglas Houghton, Michigan's first state geologist and the man most responsible for launching the copper rush in the first place after his 1841 survey, identified the extent of the deposits, never got the chance to reconcile the two tracks either. In October of 1845, while still in the field surveying the Keweenaw coastline, Houghton and two companions drowned when their canoe capsized in a storm near Eagle River. He was 36 years old. His body was not recovered until the following spring. The survey that might have connected the mining data he was gathering to the oral tradition schoolcraft was gathering only a few hundred miles away, never had a chance to be written by the one man positioned to do both. What is left, more than a century and a half later, is scattered across institutions that were never built to talk to each other. The Ontonagon boulder itself now sits in the Department of Mineral Sciences at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History in Washington, purchased from a Detroit merchant in 1843 and shipped east before the copper rush it helped trigger had even fully begun. Its original resting place on the Ontonagon River no longer exists as open ground. The site now lies beneath the Victoria Reservoir, submerged behind a dam built in the 20th century to generate hydroelectric power, the same river that once carried Alexander Henry, Julius Eldred, and generations of Ojibwe visitors, now backed up and still. Whittlesey's original tracing linen map of the Keweenaw pits survives in archival collections, consulted now mostly by historians rather than geologists. The Minong copper mining district on Isle Royale received formal recognition as a National Historic Landmark only in the past few years, an acknowledgement that the ancient and the industrial workings there are historically inseparable, a designation that took more than a century to arrive after Knapp first opened his pit above the Ontonagon. Most of the pits Whittlesey mapped in 1863 have never been excavated by an archaeologist at all. Between 2019 and 2020, National Park Service archaeologists attempted a systematic relocation of pits recorded in Whittlesey's original survey, working from the 19th-century maps alongside modern positioning equipment. Even with that technology, positive identification proved difficult, the sites masked by dense second-growth forest, modern mining debris, and more than a century of accumulated leaf litter, the same kind of cover that once concealed the pits from Knapp until he happened to be walking that particular ridge on that particular winter day. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive survey techniques exist now that could, in principle, map the full extent of the district without disturbing another inch of it, but no coordinated survey on that scale has yet been funded or attempted. The stone hammers that survive sit scattered across small regional museums and private collections, most never systematically catalogued as a single body of evidence. The tree that grew 395 rings above an abandoned pit of oak and copper is long gone, cut down by the man who found it, its rings counted once, and then left to whatever record Knapp chose to keep. What remains is the pit itself, and the thousands like it strung along a mineral range that a people mined for millennia before anyone thought to ask, in writing, who they were. The lake is still there, the copper is still there, most of it in veins nobody has finished working. And the record that finally answered the question Whittlesey could not, the record written in sediment and in the rings of trees rather than in any government report, only became legible within the last few years, which means the ground beneath Lake Superior has been holding the correct answer for longer than anyone alive has been holding the theory that replaced it. Researchers are still pulling cores from the small lakes near the Keweenaw and Isle Royale each field season, reading the copper and lead trapped in each layer of mud, the way Knapp once read growth rings in a single hemlock, one thin band at a time. Every core adds a little more resolution to a chronology that took a century and a half to become legible at all. The people who mined this shoreline for 4,000 years left almost nothing in writing, because writing was never their record. The lake kept it instead, in wood, in leather, in mud, and in stone, waiting for instruments patient enough to read it back. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.